Carol Ann Duffy is one of the most famous British women writers of today. She is a poet, a playwright, and a professor. She has collected numerous awards, including the Somerset Maugham Award and the T.S. Eliot Prize. The important concerns of her poetry include gender, oppression, violence, and romantic love. She was Poet Laureate for 10 years. She was the first woman to become the Poet Laureate, the first Scottish-born Poet Laureate, and the first member of the LGBT community to be nominated to the office. And you must remember that the office of the Poet Laureate is one which has been held by the likes of John Dryden, William Wordsworth, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Ted Hughes. Anne Hathaway is one of the most popular and the most highly prescribed poems of Carol Ann Duffy. It is one of the gems of contemporary British poetry. I like to tell my students that there are two kinds of titles. A poem can have an emphasive title or an additive title. An emphasive title emphasizes certain aspects in the thematic structure of the poem. If an emphasive title is removed, the thematic structure of the poem does not suffer any serious damage. An additive title adds to the thematic structure of the poem. If an additive title is removed, the thematic structure of the poem is very seriously damaged. The present poem, Anne Hathaway, has an additive title. If the title is removed, it is very difficult for us to understand this poem is about Anne Hathaway, the wife of William Shakespeare. Of course, the poem has an epigraph which suggests that the central character in the poem is Shakespeare's wife, Anne Hathaway. But without the title, it would not be possible for the reader to conclude, to confirm conclusively, to conclude definitely that the central character in the poem is William Shakespeare's wife. William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway in the November of 1582. William was 18 years old, while Anne was 26. The wedding was hastily arranged, and it appears that Anne Hathaway was a shotgun bride, for Susanna, their first child, was born 6 months after the wedding. Not many years after the marriage, William Shakespeare moved to London in order to pursue his career as an actor and a playwright. In his will, William Shakespeare mentions his wife, mentions Anne Hathaway, and bestows upon her his second best bed. The cottage of Anne Hathaway, the Anne Hathaway cottage, is now owned by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. It is the cottage in which Anne Hathaway grew up. It was built some 500 years back and was in the hands of the Hathaway family for centuries, 13 generations to be exact. Traditional Shakespeare scholarship has over the centuries suggested that the marriage between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway was a rather unhappy one. There is no direct evidence to prove this, but the fact that the wedding of William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway was hastily arranged, the fact that Anne Hathaway was a shotgun bride, the fact that she was about a decade, nearly a decade, older than him, the fact that he ran away from London shortly after the birth of their third child, the fact that he, according to traditional lore, never took Anne Hathaway to London, and that they led more or less separate lives, and above all the fact that innumerable sarcastic barbs aimed at the institution of marriage, aimed at the institution of marriage, are scattered throughout his plays, have all been used to suggest that the relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway was a rather unhappy one. Much was made by Shakespeare scholars of the fact that Anne Hathaway is mentioned only once in William Shakespeare's will, and that too in order to bestow upon her, in order to give her his second best bed. Had William Shakespeare already given his best bed to his mistress? If an autobiographical element can be located in the sonnets of Shakespeare, we have to arrive at the conclusion that William Shakespeare was now stranger to extramarital affairs. The present poem, Anne Hathaway by Carol Ann Duffy, turns this traditional view on its head. An epigraph is a short piece of writing which is used to inaugurate a book or a chapter or a short story or a poem. The epigraph is placed at the very beginning of the work of literature. The epigraph serves to adumbrate the general theme of the work. It serves to set the tone of the work, and sometimes also serves to operate as the starting point of the trajectory of the thematic movement of the work. The present poem begins with an epigraph. The epigraph is a line taken from the will of William Shakespeare. It is the part of the will where William Shakespeare mentions his wife, Anne Hathaway. Through this part of the will, the testator, William Shakespeare, bestows upon his wife, Anne Hathaway, after his death, his second best bed. This is the epigraph with which the poem under discussion opens. I have already spoken about the will of William Shakespeare and the fact that William Shakespeare mentions his wife in his will and that he gives his second best bed to her. This was seen by mainstream Shakespeare scholarship as a sort of evidence of the fact that William Shakespeare did not care much for his wife. Why did he give his second best bed to his wife and not his best bed? Did he give his best bed to his mistress when he was alive? And is that why he does not speak of his best bed in his will, but only of his second best bed, which is through this part of the will given to his wife Anne Hathaway? As I've already observed, in the present poem, Carol Ann Duffy stands the traditional interpretation of Shakespeare scholarship, of Shakespeare scholars on its head. You must remember that most of the early Shakespeare scholars were men, and there certainly was a patriarchal perspective in their interpretations, in their readings, and perhaps that is why they came to the conclusion that the relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway was was a rather unhappy one. Much was made by them of the fact that William Shakespeare in his will gives his second best bed and not his best bed to Anne Hathaway. In the present poem, the poet has her own explanation to offer, and it is a very authentic explanation backed by historical, sociological, cultural research. In Elizabethan England, a bed was a status symbol. Not many people could afford a bed, strange though it may seem to us today. The best bed was usually positioned in a bedroom on the ground floor. And it was used by the guests because the owner of the bed wanted to show off, wanted the guests to know that he had such a grand bed. The second best bed was in his own bedroom, and it was here that he slept. To a loving husband, the second best bed is more dear than the best bed, because it is the second best bed that is his marriage bed. Another interpretation is that, according to Elizabethan law, the best bed went to the children, and the widow was usually given the second best bed. Be that as it may, the point that the poet wants to make is that the fact that William Shakespeare gave his second best bed to Anne Hathaway through his will does not mean that he did not love her. She explains in the course of the poem that the second best bed was the marriage bed, which was shared by William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, and that the best bed was given to the guests who occupied the bedroom on the ground floor. The poem opens with a spectacular conflation of the romantic relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway on the one hand, and the world that William Shakespeare created through his writings on the other. To be more specific, the conflation is between the bed, the second best bed, mentioned in the will of William Shakespeare, the bed in which Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare made love to each other, and the dazzling world that William Shakespeare created through his drama, through his poetry, the spinning world of forests, castles, torchlight, cliff-top seas, the world into which he would dive for pearls. I think this is a very original and a very brilliant conflation. On the one hand, you have the romantic relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, and on the other, you have the world created by the writings of arguably the greatest dramatist, arguably the greatest poet in human history. The poet seems to suggest that there is much in common between the two. For the creation of literature, the writing of drama, the crafting of poetry has to be a labor of love, has to be a passion, has to be an obsession as much as a romantic relationship. The lines that follow continue this brilliant conflation further. The poet says, "My lover's words were shooting stars which fell to earth as kisses on these lips." An identification is established between the words of Shakespeare the dramatist, the words of Shakespeare the poet on the one hand, and the kisses that he bestowed on the lips of Anne Hathaway on the other. As I said, the creation of literature and the making of love have a lot in common. You cannot be a great writer unless you are also a great lover. Ultimately, the poet writes, the dramatist writes because of his passion, because of his obsession, because of his grace. It is very similar to the passion, to the obsession, to the craze. That is romantic love. A shooting star is, of course, a meteor. A close parallelism is established between The perfect romance between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare on the one hand, and the great literature that William Shakespeare created on the other. My body now a softer rhyme to his. Just as in traditional verse, a line is expected to rhyme with another line, depends on the rhyme scheme. Suppose the rhyme scheme is A, the first line has a rhyme, and that rhyme has to be maintained by the second line. In this part of the poem, the speaker, Anne Hathaway, explains that there was a perfect rhyme between herself and her husband. I think I should be more specific. My body now a softer rhyme to his. The body of the speaker was able to establish a perfect rhyme with the rhyme of the body of William Shakespeare. Now echo assonance. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds at short intervals. Echo is the recreation of the same sound, usually in a fainter manner. The speaker, Anne Hathaway, explains that her body became a perfect rhyme to the body of William Shakespeare. It became a perfect echo. It became a perfect assonance. I think I said that a parallelism is established between the perfect romance between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare on the one hand, and the great literature that William Shakespeare created on the other. Perhaps I should I should add that it is not merely parallelism, it is also interpenetration. The poet creates a situation in which the two things interpenetrate each other. The romantic life between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway on the one hand, and the great literature that William Shakespeare created on the other. His touch, a verb, dancing at the center of a noun. A very important thing when you write is the agreement between verb and noun. The verb has to agree with the noun. The verb has to dance to the tunes of the noun. Whether the noun is singular or plural decides the shape of the verb. The poet establishes a parallel between the very bonded physical relationship between Anne Hathaway and her husband, and the very bonded grammatical relationship between the verb and the noun. And of course, you must not forget that William Shakespeare was simultaneously, from the perspective of the poet, simultaneously a great lover, a great husband, and a great writer. Some nights I dreamed you'd written to me, my bed a page beneath his writer's hands. There's such a lot in common between the creation of literature and the making of love. And the speaker says that she sometimes dreams that when her husband, when her lover was making love to her, he was in a way writing immortal literature. The, the bed is very much like a page, like a blank page on which the writer inscribes the words of his text. And you must remember that the bed here is the bed mentioned in the will of Shakespeare, and the bed that through his will Shakespeare gives his wife. Just as there is romance and drama in the writings of William Shakespeare, there is also romance and drama in the relationship between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare, in the love making between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare. The writings of William Shakespeare are praised for their concreteness, for their sensuousness, for their physicality, for their closeness to reality. The speaker says that all these things are present in the lovemaking. Romance and drama are played by touch, by scent, by taste. If touch, scent, and taste are present in the plays of Shakespeare, in the poems of Shakespeare, they are very much present in the relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, in the love-making between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. Thus the poet brilliantly establishes that there is a lot in common between the world of the writings of William Shakespeare, the world of the plays and the poems of William Shakespeare, and the world of the relationship between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare. They have so much in common. They interpenetrate each other. They are very much like each other. They naturally establish a conflation of each other. One is a metaphor for the other. The speaker now gives an explanation for why the second best bed was bestowed upon her. She tells us that the best bed was positioned in the bedroom on the ground floor, and it was occupied frequently by the guests. As I've already explained, the bed was a status symbol in Elizabethan England, in Jacobean England, and the best bed was placed in the guest bedroom, positioned in the guest bedroom because its owner wanted to show off, wanted to impress his guests. And it was only the second best bed which was used by him and his wife. Here, the speaker, Anne Hathaway, works out a contrast between what happened on the second best bed and what happened on the best bed. To dribble, of course, means to allow the flow of liquid in small quantities, in drops, or in a small stream. The point that the speaker seems to be making is that by the side of the relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, by the side of the relationship between the speaker and her husband, the relationships of the guests, of the couples who occupied the best bed was prosaic. If the relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway was spectacular poetry, the relationship between the couples who were the guests of the family was nothing but dull prose. The speaker calls her late husband, my living, laughing love. As far as Anne Hathaway is concerned, William Shakespeare is immortal. He lives in her heart eternally. Not just that, as arguably the world's greatest literary figure, he lives in the hearts of his readers forever. My living, laughing love. What a beautiful construction. Not only is William Shakespeare immortal, Anne Hathaway reveals that she has now become a widow and she holds her late husband in the casket of her head. Her head has become a casket. A casket, as I said, is a small ornamental box in this context for holding the ashes of a dead person. The point that the speaker is trying to make is that vivid memories of William Shakespeare play in her mind, play in her head, and she holds him in the casket of her widow's head, just as he had held her on this second best bed. The comparison as well as the contrast is between William Shakespeare holding Anne Hathaway on the second best bed and Anne Hathaway holding the dead William Shakespeare, or holding the memory of William Shakespeare in the casket of her head, in her head which has now become a casket for his memory, for his ashes, just as the ashes of a dead person are kept in a casket. The memory of William Shakespeare are kept in the casket of Anne Hathaway's head. Anne Hathaway is a poem written by a great poet. It is also a poem written by a great professor. No one except a professor, no one but a Shakespeare scholar would have written this, could have written this poem. Take the subject matter of the poem to begin with, the title of the poem to begin with, Anne Hathaway. Everyone has heard of William Shakespeare, but only students of literature have heard of Anne Hathaway. The poem is extremely rich in its intertextuality. There are powerful allusions to the masterpieces of Shakespeare, such as forests, castles, torchlight, cliff tops, seas, where he would dive for pearls. Forests. The allusion could be to the forest of Arden, the forest of Arden, in As You Like It. Castles. Certainly an indirect reference to Hamlet and its castle, the castle of Elsinore. Torchlight could be a reference to Romeo and Juliet. Cliff tops could be an allusion to King Lear. Seas could be an allusion to The Tempest, where he would dive for pearls. very clearly an allusion to that pearl of a line from The Tempest. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Full fathom 5 thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. That is how the song goes, if I remember it correctly, the song in The Tempest. The poet makes use of technical terms like rhyme, echo, assonance. Only a literature scholar would use such terms in her poetry. Echo, for example, could mean echoism or onomatopoeia, the figure of speech in which the sound echoes the sense. Besides, the language of the poem appears to be very much influenced by Shakespeare. It is a poem written by a poet who has been reading Shakespeare all her life, who has loved Shakespeare, and who is very familiar with Shakespeare. You may be asked to explain the sort of relationship that is depicted in the poem. At the very beginning, you have to say that the poem attempts to stand mainstream traditional Shakespeare scholarship on its head by depicting a very different kind of relationship that, according to the poet, existed between William Shakespeare and his wife, Anne Hathaway. The relationship that we meet with in the poem is a very strong relationship, a very intimate relationship, a very tender relationship, a very loving relationship, a very exciting relationship, a very blissful relationship. In fact, it is possible, according to the poet, to see the relationship as a sort of counterpart to the exciting, glamorous, spectacular world of literature that William Shakespeare created. William Shakespeare, the poet, created his poems. William Shakespeare, the dramatist, created his plays. And William Shakespeare, the husband, in a way, created his wife. If there had not been William Shakespeare, there would not have been Anne Hathaway as we understand her through this poem. The poet makes use of euphemisms, puns, squibbles to suggest a powerful physicality present in the relationship, to suggest a powerful sexuality present in the relationship. The relationship was a perfect one, was a blissful one, was an exciting one, in contrast to the relationships that married couples usually have. This contrast is deliberately highlighted by comparing, by contrasting what William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway did on the second best bed and what the guest did on the best bed. Traditionally, it used to be said that William Shakespeare gave his second best bed to his wife Anne Hathaway because The best bed had already been given to his mistress. But Ann Duffy, in the present poem, explains that the second best bed is the marital bed of William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, and that is why it is given to her. The contrast between the relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway on the one hand and other married couples on the other is like the contrast between poetry and prose. By the time the poem comes to an end, we realize that William Shakespeare is dead. Anne Hathaway has been widowed. But that does not in any way decrease the brightness of her relationship with her husband, with her late husband. I think that not much time has passed since William Shakespeare has died, because it is shortly after the death of a person that the will of the person is opened, and the poem begins with an extract from the will of William Shakespeare, indicating that, suggesting that the death of Shakespeare has just occurred, suggesting that the death of Shakespeare is a rather recent event. The widowed Anne Hathaway sees her head as a casket, just as the casket holds the precious ashes of the dead person. The casket of her head holds the memories of her late husband. The casket of her head holds the memories of her dead husband as tenderly, as lovingly, as intimately as he used to hold her in the second best bed. It is extremely significant that the word bed is repeated, I think, 5 times, including the epigraph. 5 times in the poem. The central metaphor of the poem is the bed. The bed symbolizes the relationship. The bed signifies, emphasizes the physicality, the sexuality, the intimacy present in the relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. An attempt can be made to critique the poem from feminist perspectives. Ann Duffy is frequently referred to as a feminist poet, and she has made a very significant contribution to feminist writing. You must remember that this poem is taken from her most famous collection, The World's Wife. The World's Wife. In history, we frequently hear about husbands, about men, about patriarchs. But what about the women? What about the wives? We never hear about them. The book is an attempt to correct the situation. And I think that we can easily call Anne Hathaway, the poem Anne Hathaway, a milestone in British feminist literature. The very fact that the poet chose to write about Anne Hathaway, that forgotten woman, that unheard of woman, that neglected wife who spent an entire lifetime in God-forsaken Stratford, while her husband had a rollicking time in London, while her husband painted the town red in London, is a bold step for the cause of feminism. Not only does she write about Anne Hathaway, she gives a voice to Anne Hathaway. We always hear the voices of men, of the fathers, of the patriarchs, of the husbands, of the lovers. We almost never hear the voices of the women. And here this poem gives a voice to Anne Hathaway. Certainly a remarkable contribution to feminist writing. Not only just this, the fact that the poem very subtly, very indirectly suggests that Anne Hathaway occupied a position of centrality in the life of William Shakespeare. It even subtly, indirectly suggests that Anne Hathaway could have been a role model for Shakespeare's heroines. She speaks of the cliff tops, of the forests, the torchlight, the seas, and thus the castles, and thus she very subtly alludes to the masterpieces of Shakespeare. And one suspects that the poet is trying to suggest that Anne Hathaway was a sort of role model for some of the heroines of Shakespeare. Or perhaps, to go one more step further, Anne Hathaway was the muse of William Shakespeare, the woman who inspired, the divine woman who inspired the magic of William Shakespeare's poetry. And we may even go to the extent of stating that if there had been no Anne Hathaway, there would have been no William Shakespeare. Thus, the feminist component in the poem is remarkably strong, remarkably powerful. At the same time, I would like to point out that beyond a point, the poem fails as a feminist, as a piece of feminist writing. This is because Shakespeare is given a very active role in the poem. William Shakespeare is given a very active role in the poem, while Anne Hathaway is relegated to a very passive role. It is true that it is Anne Hathaway who speaks the entire poem, but the lines of the poem make it clear that the man, the husband, the lover, was the one playing the active role, while the woman, the wife, Anne Hathaway, was the person who was being acted upon. In fact, the poem takes the metaphor even further and suggests that just as Shakespeare is the creator of the magical world of his plays and his poems, Shakespeare is also the creator of Anne Hathaway, the wife. So, from a very feminist perspective, it is very disappointing because the poem, the narrative of the poem, the narrative trajectory of the poem surrenders to the traditional patriarchal paradigms and protocols by assigning to Anne Hathaway, to the woman, a passive role, and by giving the man, the husband, the lover, a very active role, a very creative role, even goes to the extent of glorifying William Shakespeare as the creator of Anne Hathaway as we understand her. I would like to make one more point to demonstrate how the poem fails when we analyze it from a feminist perspective. As a hardcore feminist, I have to say that it is very disappointing to hear of Anne Hathaway becoming a widow and treasuring the memories of her husband in her head, just as one treasures the ashes of a much loved person in a casket. The head becomes a casket, and instead of the ashes in the casket, the memories of the dead husband are placed. And it appears that once she becomes a widow, Anne Hathaway does not have any option other than to live, to continue to live as a widow, cherishing her memories of her late husband. So again, we have the life of a woman which is completely dependent on the life of her husband, on the life of the man. And even after the death of the man, the woman continues to be emotionally dependent on the man, continues to lead a life which is a sort of echo of the life she had lived as the wife of the man when he was alive. I would have been happier if the poet had made Anne Hathaway think of remarriage, for example, or made it clear that she has a life which is quite independent of the life of her husband, dead or alive. So, though to some extent the poem the poem succeeds from the feminist perspective, ultimately we have to conclude that it fails as a feminist poem because it refuses to go beyond a point. It succumbs to the stereotypes. It succumbs to the patriarchal protocols. It succumbs to the patriarchal paradigms, and though it gives a voice to a voiceless woman, relegates her to a secondary role, to a passive role, to the role of a creation rather than to the role of a creator. Let us attempt to focus critical attention on the technical aspects, on the stylistic aspects of the poem. It is possible to see the poem as a dramatic monologue. It is certainly a monologue because the entire poem is spoken by Anne Hathaway. It can be called a dramatic monologue because it fulfills most of the conditions necessary for a poem to become a dramatic monologue. There is a speaker, Anne Hathaway, wife of William Shakespeare. To whom does she address the entire monologue? It's not clear. It could be a friend, it could be a neighbor, it could be a close relative. There is certainly a listener, but the identity of the listener is not clear. A dramatic monologue is usually cited at a critical point in the life of the speaker. This is very much applicable in the present poem because Anne Hathaway has been recently widowed. The will of William Shakespeare has just been opened, has just been probated. It is not many days since William Shakespeare breathed his last. An important feature of the dramatic monologue is that there should be character revelation. Certainly this is present in the poem. We come to know of the character of Anne Hathaway and to some extent, or to a large extent, of her husband, of her late husband, William Shakespeare. A dramatic monologue ideally should give glimpses into the world in which it is cited, in which it is located. This is certainly there in the poem. We get pictures of Elizabethan England. We get glimpses into the customs, into the traditions of Elizabethan England. For example, in the custom of placing the best bed in the guest bedroom and using the second best bed as the marital bed. We also get glimpses of the world of the greatest Elizabethan writer of the day, the greatest writer of the day, the greatest Elizabethan writer, William Shakespeare. So I think Anne Hathaway is a very successful dramatic monologue. I'm sure that Robert Browning would have been very proud of having written it had he written it. The poem is organized in 14 lines. It is a sonnet. The sonnet is arguably the favorite literary form of William Shakespeare. There is a sonnet by William Wordsworth which begins with the words, "Scorn not the sonnet, scorn not the sonnet, critic." And then Wordsworth explains, "With this key, Shakespeare unlocked his heart. With this key, Shakespeare unlocked his heart." In numerous interviews, Carol Ann Duffy has revealed that the sonnet is also her favorite literary form. But the poem under discussion is a rather unconventional sonnet. It violates almost all the rules of the traditional sonnet. For example, leave alone the sonnet, in traditional verse, the first letter of the first word of every line has to be capitalized. The poet refuses to do that in the present poem. I said that Anne Hathaway is a sonnet. It is a sonnet. But its rhyme scheme is chaotic, if at all it has a rhyme scheme. Only the last two lines, head and bed, the last two lines rhyme forcefully, using the words head and bed. Most of the lines of the poem refuse to submit themselves to scansion. In fact, I've been spending quite some time trying to scan the lines, and I don't think I've succeeded. The lines refuse to submit themselves to scansion. Perhaps the only feature of the sonnet, other than the form of 14 lines that the present poem, only important feature of the sonnet, other than the 14-line format, that the present poem possesses is the volta. The Italian word volta means turn. In the traditional sonnet, there is a twist in the thematic trajectory. Either at the end of the octave, at the beginning of the sestet, or in the couplet concluding the sonnet. There is a volta here that occurs just before the concluding two lines, the last two lines of the poem. The volta occurs by the speaker suddenly revealing that she has become a widow, revealing the fact of the death of William Shakespeare. All along, the impression that the reader gets is that there is a very bonded relationship between husband and wife, between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. And not even the slightest clue is given about the death of William Shakespeare. But suddenly, when we reach the last two lines of the poem, we realize that William Shakespeare is no more, and all that Anne Hathaway can preserve in the casket of her head are the ashes of his memory. So, the present poem is a sonnet. It is organized in 14 lines. It possesses a powerful volta, but most of the conventional rules of the sonnet are violated by the poem. The rhyme scheme is chaotic, the lines do not scan, and even the convention of opening every line with a capital letter has been disobeyed. The diction of the poem is very simple. In fact, there is a Shakespearean touch about it. The poet uses very ordinary words, but uses them in extraordinary ways. The magic of the poem is woven by the poet using a very ordinary diction, a very simple diction, a very everyday diction. In fact, Carol Ann Duffy has repeatedly said that she does not like to use unusual words or strange words or words that are not understood, words that are not understood by ordinary people. She uses ordinary words, simple words, everyday words, but uses them in such a manner that they are able to create a magical effect by their use. So I would say that the diction of the poem is simultaneously simple and spectacular, not because spectacular words are used, but because simple words are used in such a way as to create spectacular effects. I shall give you an example. In the very opening line of the poem, the poet says, "The bed we loved in." Any other poet, a lesser poet, would have written, "The bed we slept in." But by replacing the word slept with the word loved, the poet conjures a whole magical world of lovemaking, of marital bliss, of sexual ecstasy. You must remember that towards the end of the poem, I think it's in the fourth last line, the poet speaks of the best bed which was given to the guests. And what did the guests do on the bed? Our guests dozed on, while we loved in the bed, while we made love in the bed, our guests dozed on. The contrast is between the marriage of William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway on the one hand, and the marriage of the guests on the other. I think the poet wants to make it clear that there was something very unusual about the marriage of Anne Hathaway to William Shakespeare. It was not a run-of-the-mill marriage. It was not a conventional marital relationship. It was very different from the marital relationships that we often see in this world. I would like to give you one more example. In line 3, the poet says, and Anne Hathaway says, "My lover's words, not my husband's words." The point is that throughout their marital life, Anne Hathaway's husband was also her lover. He was more her lover than her husband. If she had said my husband's words, it would have shattered the effect completely. The point is that William Shakespeare was more the lover of Anne Hathaway than her husband, though, of course, I find it very difficult to believe this. How can a husband also be a lover, unless, of course, it is the lover of some other woman? Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds. Examples of alliteration from the poem under discussion include living, laughing, love, and best bed. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. Examples of assonance from the poem under consideration include next, best, bed. I repeat, next, best, bed. Allusion is an indirect reference. Part of the richness of the poem under discussion is generated by its thickly allusive nature. There are repeated allusions to the writings of Shakespeare, to the life of Shakespeare, the plays that are brought to the mind of the reader as a result of the allusions include As You Like It, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, The Tempest. The sensitive reader is also reminded of the magnificent sonnets of Shakespeare. Euphemism is the use of indirect language to describe something which has the potential to embarrass the listener or the reader if it is presented in a blunt, in a direct manner. I think the poet uses euphemism when she writes, I quote, his touch, a verb, dancing in the center of a noun, unquote. It is a euphemism for an advanced stage of lovemaking between husband and wife, who incidentally, but also strangely, are also lovers. I become excited when I have to talk about the use of metaphors in the poem. A metaphor is an attempt to describe something by referring to something else. A metaphor is an attempt to describe something in the terms of something else. William Shakespeare was the ultimate master of the metaphor. It appears that William Shakespeare's magical mastery of the metaphor has rubbed off on Carol Ann Duffy. At every turn in the poem, we come across metaphors, and brilliant metaphors at that. This is one of the many reasons why I say that the poet displays a Shakespearean touch in the poem. The poem opens with a triple metaphor. I think I can call it a triple metaphor. The bed we loved in, not the bed we slept in, but the bed we loved in. That is metaphorized as a world, as a spinning world. Spinning because the world is spinning all the time. That's what specialists tell us, scientists tell us. And also because the lovemaking has left the lovers a bit dizzy. Please remember, it's not merely a world. It's a world of forests, castles, torchlight, cliff tops, seas. So you have two stages of the metaphor here. The bed becomes a world. And the world, not just a world, not just a world in a vague manner, but a world in a very specific manner of forests, castles, torchlight, cliff top, seas. And finally, the third metaphor, the triple metaphor, the last part of the triple metaphor, where he would dive for pearls. The world becomes a sea, and he becomes a pearl diver in that sea. This is something which can match the performance of Shakespeare. This is followed by a spectacular double metaphor. My lover's words were shooting stars which fell to earth as kisses on these lips. See how the metaphor forms itself. It's a double metaphor. The lover's words, Shakespeare's words, become shooting stars. And then the shooting stars become kisses, not vague kisses, kisses meant for his wife, kisses which fall on the lips of his wife, which fall on the lips of Anne Hathaway, which fall on the lips of the speaker in the poem. The symbol is a figure of speech in which one thing stands for another, one thing represents another. The central symbol in the poem, the most important symbol in the poem is, of course, the bed. The bed symbolizes the marriage between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare, the relationship that she has with her husband. It symbolizes her life as a wife. And finally, it symbolizes his magnificent contribution to world literature. I think that the head in the penultimate line, the widow's head in the penultimate line, can be seen as a synecdoche, a part standing for the whole. This is because the memory of her husband is not preserved by her, held by her, merely in her head, but in herself, but in her entire self. It is not merely, it is in her mind, or it is in her body. It is in her entire self that the memory of William Shakespeare is preserved. If that is the interpretation, I think this is a very good synecdoche, a part standing for the whole, the head standing for the entire person. The poem has a very appropriate title. Perhaps this is something I should have said earlier. We have discussed the title in some detail. Anne Hathaway, a very simple, matter-of-fact title which serves its purpose excellently. You must remember that this poem was first published as part of a collection titled The World's Wife. The World's Wife. The wife of the world, the singular is used here because I think the poet is thinking of the position, the experience, the perspectives of the wife of the world. We have heard a lot about the world, but the world is always populated by men. Here we get an opportunity to hear of the wife of the world. We frequently hear about the men, not only about the men, from the men. Even if we hear about the women, we almost never hear from them. This book, in general, The World's Wife in general, and Anne Hathaway in particular, is an attempt to correct the situation. It's a much needed corrective where we are given the opportunity to listen to listen to the voice of a woman who all along down the centuries had been known as nothing more than the wife of the greatest writer of the world, arguably the greatest writer of the world. What is the theme of the poem? Again, this was something I should have asked earlier in my class. When I posed this question to a student, she said that the theme of the poem is the marriage between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare. I would say that that is a very simplistic way of reading the poem, of interpreting the poem. In fact, there is no one theme for the poem. The poem deals with a host of themes. The important thematic concerns of the poem include love, marriage, sex, gender roles, the experience of being the wife of the world's greatest dramatist, Elizabethan traditions and conventions, death, widowhood. It is certainly a rather short poem, just 14 lines, but it holds within its bosom a vast array of thematic concerns. You have to read the poem repeatedly in order to allow it to yield up its meaning comprehensively. It cannot be denied that Anne Hathaway was something of a cradle snatcher, that she married a boy nearly a decade younger to her, and quite possibly was a shrew. However, it is this Anne Hathaway whom Carol Ann Duffy has chosen to glorify, and it is her relationship with William Shakespeare that Carol Ann Duffy has chosen to romanticize and idealize. I would like to conclude the class by observing that Carol Ann Duffy is certainly not the first person to write about Anne Hathaway. Some critics believe that William Shakespeare was the first person to write about Anne Hathaway. It is argued that, it is contended that Sonnet 145, yes, 145 of William Shakespeare is about his relationship with Anne Hathaway. The main ground for raising this contention is that there is a pun in the penultimate line of the poem, hate away, which could be a subtle indirect reference to Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife. In the 19th century, Emma Severn wrote a novel, Shakespeare in Love, Anne Hathaway or Shakespeare in Love. If I remember correctly, the year was 1845, which is about the relationship between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare. James Joyce's works make repeated references to Anne Hathaway, and this includes Ulysses. These are some of the important writers who have chosen to write about Anne Hathaway. So the point is that Carol Ann Duffy is not the first person to write about Anne Hathaway. The first person probably was William Shakespeare himself.